Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Future of Education. It's Thursday, August 26th, 2011. Our special guest is Bob Compton, filmmaker and the producer of the Finland phenomenon. Thanks for being here, Bob. So your mic went off. Click it once and it should go back on.
Can you hear?
Yep, good. Anyway, glad to have you here, Bob. Sure appreciate your coming on the show. The Future of Education is sponsored by Blackboard Collaborate. The project I work on is Learn Central. It's also sponsored by my Web 2.0 Labs project. It's web20labs.com. Coming up in November, so fun, this Library 2.011 free worldwide virtual conference that's coming up. Over 2,000 people have signed up so far. What just a lot of fun to see the enthusiasm and interest in this topic. San Jose State University is the core sponsor of that event, and we're delighted that they've supported it. Also in November, the 2011 Global Education Conference, 5 days, also free, 24 hours a day. If you missed this party last year, please don't this year. Lots of fun. Coming up on the Future of Education next week, Richard and Rebecca Dufour on learning communities. There's a little bit of a break while I'm traveling. Howard Gardner then comes on to talk about the unschooled mind. Sam Sheltain on his book, Faces of Learning. Bob Gleiner on his movie, Lessons from the Real World. Cecilia D'Oliveira, the director of MIT's OpenCourseWare, will be on the show. Then we have a special show on a successful iPads in the Classroom project. Can't wait to talk about this. I've been very skeptical of iPads in the classroom, and hopefully I'll be proved wrong. Peter Cookson on a Children's Education Bill of Rights, and then Alan Blankstein on improving individual schools, and lots more fun in the works. If you've missed the show, they are all recorded, and they're up on futureofeducation.com in full Illuminate versions and MP3 versions. Jeff Piontek talked about education change and reform. Gary Lopez on Hippocampus. Doug Rushkoff on Program or Be Programmed, which I've referred to several times in the last couple of weeks, so it's a book that stuck with me. Jim Mayfield on humanitarian education programs. Anyway, lots of fun. Hopefully there's something there you'll be interested in. I'm going to give you all now permissions to indicate where you are on the whiteboard. Look for the star icon to the left of the map. Click on that, and then if you click on the whiteboard, that star should show up for you. And feel free to do a shout out in the chat. I know we've got lots of weird weather. I was in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday and experienced the earthquake there. I had to fly all the way to D.C., a California boy, to experience an earthquake in Washington. I know there was an earthquake in Colorado, another in Peru. Lots of crazy weather and other things going on around the world. So let us know where you're listening from. New Zealand, Australia, British Isles. Not quite sure where in the Middle East that is, but hopefully you'll tell us. I thought we had someone from Finland on. Wherever you're listening from, or if you're listening to the recording, we sure do appreciate your participation, and hopefully you'll find something of value tonight. I sure have, just from preparing. Bob, I just love this movie, and it precipitated my actually watching the second 2 Million Minutes movie, which I had not seen before. I'd seen the original. But I heard a story. I told somebody I was interviewing you, and they said that you had gotten stuck in Finland because of the volcanic activity. Is that a part of the story of this movie?
Actually, that did happen. I was not there on that trip. Dr. Wagner was there with my film crew, and they did get caught for, they were there for about 2.5 weeks before they could get out. And then I went back a month later with the film crew to continue the interviews. So, yeah, they got caught there for quite a while.
Can you give us a little bit of a sense of the chronology here, how you got connected with Tony Wagner from Harvard, sort of the progression of the films to this point? Maybe kind of give us a sense of the overview.
Sure. So just to give you maybe a 1 minute on my background, I was trained as an engineer, worked for IBM, then went to Harvard Harvard Business School, and then spent 25 years as a high-tech entrepreneur and venture capitalist. I got interested in, or motivated to make my first film, 2 Million Minutes, as a result of a 2005 trip to Bangalore, India, where at the time I had 100 software developers working for one of my companies out of Chicago. And it was on that trip that I spent a lot of time with the young people. All of them were in their 20s. And I discovered how well educated they were, not just in math and science. I would have expected that because I hired them out of engineering schools. But they had a very broad gauge knowledge. They could talk about Shakespeare, they could talk about world history, world geography, and when I inquired as to where they got this knowledge, it was universally in high school. And so rather than coming back to the U.S., I stayed for another several weeks and visited high schools all around Bangalore. And what I realized, I have 2 teenage daughters, I realized that my daughters, despite going to a very expensive private school and being straight-A students, were 2 to 3 years behind their Indian peers in math, physics, chemistry, biology, computer science, world history, world geography, and English grammar. And so I came back and changed how my own daughters were educated, and then wrote a book about my experience. And then I realized that you have to actually see it to believe it. And then I made a subsequent trip to China and discovered the same thing about Chinese high schools. So I made the first film, 2 Million Minutes, which follows 2 high school seniors, a boy and a girl, in the U.S., India, and China. And that film is quite successful. Not always universally welcome. In fact, Howard Gardner was one of my harshest critics. You've got him coming on in a couple weeks. He was one of my harshest critics when I screened for the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. But what I realized was it was pretty clear that American students are never going to have the drive and intensity around education that Indians and Chinese will. But our kids are going to need to be competitive with the best educated young people around the world. And India and China each have 4 times the number of students we have. We have roughly 55 million, 56 million K through 12 students. India has 212 million and China has 200 million, and those are just the ones in school. They have another couple hundred million that would like to be in school that are right now caught in poverty. And so I started talking with people about what might be a good model for the U.S. and American kids to get up to the global standard, which is pretty clear we weren't from the PISA tests. So I was actually speaking at an education conference in New Orleans, and Tony Wagner was speaking there also, and I had read his book, The Global Achievement Gap, and we started talking afterwards and then several subsequent conversations, and it was pretty obvious. We looked at the PISA scores, and Finland has ranked number 1 in math, science, and reading since 2000. They got beat this year by China, and also edged out in reading by Korea. But it was pretty clear that Finland had an excellent education system. So Tony and I decided he had been invited to go over and speak to the Finland education leadership for their Project 2020, which is this was a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago. They were laying out their strategy for how to improve their education over the next 10 years. And so I said, well, let me send a camera crew to that trip, and then I'll come over later. I was actually over in Asia at the time, and I'll come over later, and we'll continue the interviews, and then we'll make a film about Finland. And so that's how it came about.
I wasn't aware of the book. What was the name of the book?
Well, the book is called Blogging Through India, and it's available on my website, and it talks about the education, what I learned about education in India, but it also, I traveled pretty widely in the country and tried to capture the kind of the essence of the culture, the Indian culture. And it's obviously an enormous country with 1.1 billion people, and so it's impossible to capture all of it. But I was trying to get the essence of what India was all about, because I thought most Americans weren't aware of it. So I published the book first, and then started producing the films.
Fascinating. In 2 Million Minutes, the 21st Century Solution, you really look in depth at a school called BASIS. How closely do the principles of BASIS align with what you found in Finland?
They align reasonably closely. The two founders, Olga and Michael Block. Michael was professor of economics at Arizona University, and Olga she was in Czechoslovakia. Then when the wall fell, she was among a group of Czechs who were working to bring the free enterprise system to her country, and she and Michael met and married, and then she moved over. They moved to Tucson, or he lived in Tucson. She moved there, and she was from previous marriage had two daughters, and went to enroll her daughters in American middle school, and was appalled at how terrible the education was compared to the education she had received in communist Czechoslovakia. And so what she and Michael decided to do was start a charter school. And they started BASIS School in 1998. And it was, what they did is they kind of surveyed the world and took what they thought was the best from the Finnish system, from other systems in Canada, other systems in Europe. They looked at Asia, incorporated a little bit of that in terms of they teach Mandarin, for example. But the most telling similarity between the teachers at the BASIS school and the teachers in Finland are their education credentials. In Finland, to teach at the middle school and high school level, you have to have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in the subject you teach, and then 1 year pedagogical training. And all of the teachers at the BASIS school have bachelor's and master's degrees in the subject they're teaching. For example, high school physics. The young man that teaches high school physics at BASIS Tucson has a bachelor's and master's degree in physics, and then has gets great joy from being with young people and teaching, and then has gone through the pedagogical training that the BASIS school developed for their teachers. What's interesting about BASIS is it was started in 1998 in Tucson, which is actually a relatively poor area of the country, Pima County being quite poor. And they took it's open enrollment. They took just average kids from kind of all walks of life, mostly low income, a few middle income, and quite a few Hispanics, because of the heavy Hispanic population there. And 10 years later, Newsweek ranked them the #1 high school in America. And what struck me as curious was they went from startup to being #1 in the country in 10 years, and nobody went to find out why. The Gates Foundation didn't go. Broad Foundation wasn't there. Fordham Institute didn't show up. The U.S. Department of Education didn't send anybody. The only one who went to see why was me. And so that's why I decided to make the documentary.
That moment at which they're talking about the fact that nobody went to see the school is really one of the powerful moments in the movie. The other almost emotional moment in that movie, we're talking about the 2 Million Minutes, the 21st Century Solution, were the quotes from Lisa Keegan about the difficulty of actually doing it the right way, of the cultural kind of barriers that existed there. I don't want us to get too sidetracked there. We'll come back to that and once we've sort of talked more about Finland. So at the beginning of Finland Phenomenon, you kind of, using quotes, showcase some contrast with our existing narratives about school and school reform. What is going on there? What do we believe about improving schools that Finland kind of breaks?
I guess a little bit of history about about Finland and the Finnish education system. So, coming out of World War II, Finland, like all of Europe, with the exception of Switzerland, was decimated by World War II. And then they had the compounding difficulty of, although the Soviets never occupied Finland and didn't bring it into the Soviet Union, there was a lot of pressure and a lot of tension with the Soviets. And in the 1960s, Finland's economy was 60% wood products, basically cutting down trees and cutting up lumber and then selling lumber. The country was very poor. There were a few wealthy, but mostly people were quite poor. And they had no immigration. Nobody wanted to move to Finland for a variety of reasons, but probably the winters being the main one. And so the leadership, the political and kind of the intelligentsia and the political leaders realized that the only way to raise the standard of living of their people was to increase the level of education. So they took some pretty radical steps in the early 70s. The first one being they dramatically raised the standard to be a teacher in Finland. And as I mentioned earlier, they set the standard to require to teach at the grade school level both a bachelor's and master's degree in education, and to teach at middle school and secondary school. You had to have a bachelor's and master's degree in the subject you were teaching. They also implemented a very unique way of conveying the pedagogical training. There's the student teachers spend very, very little time in a lecture hall. They spend their time following a master teacher who teaches the subject they're going to teach, for example, mathematics. And anywhere from 4 to 7 student teachers will follow that master teacher and work with him or her throughout a full year. And that accomplishes a number of things, which we can go into more detail later. But the net effect is you have a very highly educated teacher teaching a subject that they know a lot about and are quite passionate about. So they also, in the 60s and 70s, early 70s, just about every college in Finland could grant, prior to this, the change in standards, could grant a degree in education. They stopped that and narrowed it down to just the 8 top universities, and those were the only ones where teachers could be trained. So, but what kind of cuts against the grain of where America is and seems to be going more intensely every day, they do almost no high-stakes testing. They do test, they have quizzes and tests, but they don't have the kinds of high-stake tests you see in, for example, Washington, D.C., where I live, where, with the DCAS test, teachers' careers are at stake with those tests. They do have one test when they're senior year. In order to get a high school diploma, you have to pass a competency test across all subjects. They also assign very little homework. They have a very different approach in the classroom, and you have to be in the classrooms to experience it. And I try to capture it in the film. I hope I was successful doing that. They don't teach a subject to the students. They help the students discover the knowledge themselves. So, for example, in the film, rather than describing what the Pythagorean theorem is, they use a series of exercises that help the students come to their own discovery of that. And the teachers talk a lot in the interviews and in my interactions with them, a lot about helping children discover new knowledge or create new knowledge. And so that's one kind of very unique aspect, and it's again, I hope I capture it in the film. It's very different than what you see in U.S. School systems, or frankly in school systems elsewhere in the world. The second difference is they don't assign very much homework. The students might have 2 to 3 hours of homework a week through middle school, and in high school it may get up as much, close to maybe an hour a night. But it's not the heavy loads of homework that we assign in American schools. So they don't do a lot of testing. They don't do a lot of homework. And school is a much more relaxed environment than you see in the U.S. The students refer to their teachers by their first name. There's a real sense of camaraderie that you feel in the classroom there, and as opposed to a kind of an authoritarian figure, and then the students, it's much more collaborative and there's just a lot of mutual respect. So I guess those would be the quick things I would mention. We can go into as much detail as you would like, Steve.
The description of the culture of the classroom, that did come through in the film, and it also came through very much in the look at Basis School. When we look at sort of large cultural change around institutions, do you have a sense of kind of practically how that happened? Were there certain individuals who were able to tell a really compelling narrative in Finland that captured everybody? Because it feels like, with Basis being highly successful, that story just didn't get out. It doesn't get out. In fact, there are barriers to getting out. Did you have any sense in Finland of how that narrative changed?
I guess I need you to clarify a little bit when you say the narrative. I'm not sure I follow you.
Well, I think of W. Edwards Deming as being an individual who was able to kind of really tell a different story about manufacturing and quality, and gained a following of people who adopted that vision of education. So on a very practical level, even with the pressures faced by Finland, was there somebody who was really good at communicating, who helped bring everybody together around the common goal of how to shift education there?
From the research I did and all the interviews I conducted, there was not a single leader. If I understand where you're headed, there was not a single leader, for example, in the 70s who articulated a vision of what needed to change in order to raise the education level of the population and thereby raise the standard of living. And Finland is not a country, from what I can understand, and from my observations and having been there a number of times, is not a country where you have kind of standout leaders. It's a much more collaborative type of society where people work together, but they're not kind of the superstars that everybody follows. It's a very different culture that way. From the research I did and the conversations I had with the Minister of Education and others who've been obviously involved with education for decades, the change has resulted from an open dialogue among leaders from business and education and the political field in the 60s and 70s, and that debate and that discussion happened over about a 5 to 7 year period before they started implementing those changes. And then even after implementing those changes, Finland has a strong teachers union, and so what they did was they raised the bar of what it was required to become a teacher. But then they had lots of teachers, all the teachers who had been who had become teachers under the previous set of standards. And Finland is not a country that would then take radical steps and fire people. So what happened is it took literally 25 years for the teachers who had become teachers under the previous standards for them to eventually move through and retire, and to replenish the teacher corps with teachers who had been educated to the much higher standards. The happy result of that, from their perspective, was they reached kind of their peak educational performance in the year 2000, which was the year of the first PISA exam, and then they ended up being #1 in the world. So it looked like something that happened kind of suddenly, but the reality was, and you hear it in the film repeatedly, they talk about they had to learn to trust each other. They had to trust the teachers had to trust the students, the parents had to trust the system, and there's this foundation of trust that resulted in the result of which was this extraordinary improvement in the education of their children. But it took, one of the principals in one of the schools says it very clearly, he said it took us 25 years to learn how to trust. and so that's probably the most glaring difference in Finland. So there's a teacher, the teacher requirements of what it takes to become a teacher, but then I don't think I've ever heard the word trust in a positive vein in American education. You know, the American system is so broken, and there is such little trust that it's unlikely we could accomplish what the Finns were able to accomplish.
Are there cultural characteristics in the United States that make that hard for us? Are we more adversarially oriented in our politics or in the way that we do things than Finland? Can you imagine a path for us to take that would allow us to go through the same kind of process and arrive at that sort of consensus?
Well, I think you just have to look what's happened in Washington in the last 2 months to realize we are a highly confrontational society. What was unique about Finland was the survival and economic success of the entire population rested on their ability to dramatically improve how they educated their children and to significantly raise the intellectual capabilities of their youth. If they hadn't done that, they would still be chopping wood. They'd have and that would be their economy. And it's kind of an interesting parallel is back in the '60s. So Finland, 60% of their economy was based essentially on natural resources. In the 1960s in West Virginia, 60% of their economy was based on natural resources. One society decided they were going to raise the education level of their people, and today wood accounts for about 12 to 15% of their, or agricultural products and natural resources account for about 12 to 15%, and high tech accounts for 35%. In the case of West Virginia, they didn't raise their educational standards, and they are still heavily dependent on natural resources, and they are a relatively poor state economically. So it's in Finland's case, they realized if they didn't make the changes, that they would lead their children and their society would lead lives of relative poverty and struggle. America, we've been so dominant since World War II and so wealthy that we haven't had the same impetus to make the kind of changes we need to make. So that, I don't know if that answers your question. Hopefully it does.
Well, we're exploring this, and I'm in your helping us to do so. And again, I really love the film and appreciate the kind of asking questions that we may not have full answers for, but are trying to figure out. So the medium of film, and there obviously have been several films in the last year or two that have gained some visibility. Race to Nowhere. I'm blanking. Waiting for Superman. Yeah, right. So as you sort of looked at film to give voice to these different thoughts about education, how have you responded to the other films?
Well, I think in different ways. I mean, I had different reactions to each film. I would say that the Waiting for Superman, The Cartel, and others that strike me more as attacks on the education system in America, or attacks on unions in particular. Interesting. I don't see that they're that helpful, but I guess that's perhaps not the intent of the film. Race to Nowhere, Vicky's movie, I think makes some very, very good points, and about the pressures that American teens feel they're either put on themselves or put on by their parents or put on by society. I happen to believe, and one of the interesting differences in America as compared to the other top performing, or as compared to the top performing educational systems, I've actually categorized it into what I call the 5 C's of educational excellence. The first being culture, and we can come back and talk about any of these if you want. Culture, credentials of teachers, curriculum, college expectations, and choice. And so I want to touch just briefly on college expectations. To get into college in India or China or Korea, Singapore, Finland, the top performing countries, the college application is your name, your GPA, the school you went to, and your score on the entrance exam. To get into, my daughter took a summer program when she was in high school at Brown University, and a forensic science program, and really, really enjoyed it, and said, Dad, I really, really want to go to Brown. What do I need to do? And I had to say, well, hon, colleges work in mysterious ways. I can't tell you exactly, but for sure you have to take as many AP classes as you can and score high. You probably ought to be in student government. You should be, continue your athletics, year-round swimming. It would be great if you were in some of the plays, maybe have some leads in the play. You've got to do volunteer work to at least give the illusion of caring. These are all the things that colleges are going to look for. So she did all those things and submitted the applications and got accepted to Vanderbilt and Northwestern, got rejected by Brown. She said, Dad, why did that happen? I said, hon, I have no idea. And that anxiety that our high school children experience, I think, is captured very well in the Race to Nowhere. There's a lot of pressure on students in India and China and Korea, for example, Singapore, Taiwan, Japan. But in all of those countries, the pressure is very directed. You know what it takes to get into the top universities in your country. And in America, our kids are under all kinds of pressure. They're overscheduled. They're doing all kinds of things. They're trying to check all the boxes that they think colleges want because they have no idea exactly how to get into the college of their choice. And I think, anyway, so I think I thought Race to Nowhere really put a sharp point on that issue.
We interviewed Vicki on the show, and there was some agreement as well that she showcased the pressures, but that doesn't mean that rigor and that level of scholarship isn't valuable. It's just when there's no good, solid purpose, then it becomes stressful. Because certainly you've done a good job of showcasing high levels of achievement, probably similar amounts of expectations and work, but that result in feeling really good about yourself.
Exactly, and I think that's where. I think that's why we see so many of our teens who are, have, a lot of psychological problems and bulimia and a lot of drinking and other problems because they feel all this pressure and they have no way to respond to the pressure. They don't know exactly what they should do. And the parents, and I can't, our parents can't tell them because we don't know exactly, because admissions departments work in in mysterious ways.
You don't know this, Bob, but my dad was dean of admissions at both Stanford and Princeton, so we've talked about that as well, and there's lots of history. Hey, two of the really common criticisms of looking at Finland are that it's a very small country and that it's very homogeneous. So how have you kind of approached those two comments?
Yeah, those are the kind of the knee-jerk reactions when anybody talks about Finland. Here's how I look at it. Finland is 5.5 million people. So let's talk about the size issue first. 5.5 million people, and when I sent my film to Joel Klein, he sent me an email back saying, nice film, we have nothing to learn from Finland, it's too tiny because we're a country of 300 million. Well, that's not quite accurate. Finland is 5.5 million people with a curriculum for that country. America doesn't have a federal education system. We have 50 education systems. And one might argue with 17,000 school boards, we have even more than 50, but let's leave it at the 50 states. When you look at the 50 states and start to break the states down and look at them much more individually, 33 U.S. states are the same size or smaller than Finland. So when you start to compare, for example, Indiana, which is about the same size as Finland, or Colorado, you are now looking at apples to apples in terms of size. The school system in each state is set by the state legislature and the governor, and and then the administrative rules are set. Typically, it's not true. There are 50 different systems, but frequently it's set by the superintendent of schools. So any state that is 5.5 million or smaller, I think, can reasonably compare itself to Finland and should ask the question. I was just speaking yesterday in Colorado to an audience of 500. Colorado is slightly smaller than Finland. It's demographically, it's not as homogeneous as Finland, but it's not wildly diverse. It basically has a reasonably large and growing Hispanic population. But you look at Indiana as an example; it's roughly the same size as Finland. It's 88% white. Finland is 96%. So I think we do ourselves a disservice if we kind of out of hand say, well, Finland's small, we're big, and therefore we have nothing to learn. It's just not accurate. We have 33 states that have probably a lot to learn from Finland, and I think one can. And in the film, I use the example of Minnesota, where I compare Finland to Minnesota. They are almost exactly the same size. They are almost exactly the same in terms of their diversity or lack thereof, and both of them have Scandinavian roots. And yet, Minnesota isn't ranked number one in the world in math, science, and reading. And yet they spend more money than Finland per student. So the logical question is, you have similar size, similar demographics, similar ethnic heritage, spending more money and achieving dramatically less in terms of the educational results. So anyway, that's how I respond to those two comments.
And that comes out at basis school specifically, the fact that even though students come from different backgrounds, one of the founders says, somewhat specifically, we really just don't see a difference in their ability to achieve. What's the why do we have such a hard time, do you think, in the United States looking at a school like Basis? Why weren't they being visited by foundations? What is it culturally or cognitively that goes on that stops us from seeing those good examples and then doing something about them?
I think it's different depending on the institution. The thing I've learned about foundations, and I served on the board of trustees of the Kaufman Foundation in Kansas City, which is about a $1.8 billion foundation. I served on that board for 9 years, so I have some understanding of what I call foundation think. And then I've had some interaction with both the Gates and the Broad Foundation. And what I've learned is, with large foundations in America, particularly in education, if something is not their idea, then it can't be a good idea. So the Basis school was not funded by a foundation. Actually had no outside funding. It was just a husband and wife, and the school's in a strip mall in Tucson, across the street from the Office Depot and Baja Fresh sandwiches. So it doesn't look the part of what a foundation would be proud of, and because foundations are very much image conscious. And so I think when it comes to foundations, the reason they haven't pursued, and Basis is just one example. To me, it's the most glaring example of something that's highly successful in education, that serves children at a very high level, that educates them up to the global standard. Kids from low and middle income families, often from broken homes, a couple of homeless families. And so it breaks my heart that our country doesn't look at something like that and embrace it. But they're not the only excellent charter school that is doing amazing things and is generally ignored by the educational establishment and by the foundations. Why the U.S. Department of Education doesn't go look at it just absolutely baffles me. I cannot explain it, because in industry, in my business and career, if a company went from startup to being the number one in its industry in 10 years, I mean, everybody in the industry would be down there trying to figure out how they did it. And for some reason in education, Secretary Duncan talks about how the charter schools are the laboratories of innovation, where new things can be done, and we can learn from those and put them, roll them out into our education system. That's a lot of crap. I can't name a single thing that's been done by any of the best charter schools in America that the rest of the educational establishment has adopted. So, frankly, what charter schools are is it's allowing a little bit of choice out on the fringes to try and keep the masses happy, while everybody really ends up staying in the 99 or 97% education system that's government run.
So in the 21st Century Solution, Lisa Keegan, who is the former superintendent of education in Arizona, gets a fair amount of screen time, talking about not just being ignored, but sort of almost the act of attacking of people who do things differently. Is there a degree to which our conception of schooling has become kind of an emotional, generational, I don't know, I'm not quite sure how to phrase that, but the perpetuation, and how do you account for the kind of emotional attacks that basis saw?
Well, the American education, K-12 education system, in general, is mediocre compared to the top performing systems around the world. And it's very bureaucratic and obviously highly unionized, and I would say essentially sclerotic. I mean, it just doesn't. It's set in its ways, and when something pops up that is better than the norm, particularly if it's significantly better than the norm, it makes the rest of the educational system look bad. So, and I saw this. I sold one of my companies to a Fortune 500 company that shall remain nameless. But what I saw was these giant bureaucracies that are set in their ways. They actually, if anything entrepreneurial gets into the system, and anything that threatens to do better than the rest of them, it's like these antibodies come after it and try and kill it. And I saw this in a very large corporation, that nobody wants to look bad. And the way to make sure nobody looks bad is if there's anything that looks good, you try and kill it. And I see that all the time in the U.S. education system. I see it in Washington, D.C. constantly, where I spend a lot of time, and I sponsor some inner-city chess teams and inner-city robotics teams, so I spend quite a bit of time in the schools. And if anybody pops their head up and is doing something better than the rest, boy, they get attacked with a ferocity that's almost hard to believe.
So we're going to move to Q&A in just a minute. Be thinking if you have questions for Bob, you're welcome to take the microphone or put your question in the chat. If you put a question in the chat and I've missed it, I hope you'll put it back in again, and we'll try and make sure we catch it. Bob, what kind of lessons do you hope we'll take away from the film? What's your hope for what happens from this point forward, based on your having documented what is happening in Finland?
What I hope is that at least one state and one governor and one legislature and a state superintendent of schools will say, you know what, our state, we can be among the best in the world, and we're going to be among the best in the world. So how do we go about doing that? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to change our culture. The culture in American high school is not primarily an academic culture. It is, candidly, primarily a sports culture. And just to give kind of the most egregious example that I've ever seen is in Allen, Texas. For a high school of 3,200 students, they are in the process of building a $65 million football stadium. That sends very clear messages. The way culture is built, and I've done this many times when I've done corporate turnarounds, you've got to get the culture right. Culture trumps everything. In the words of Dean Kamen, the founder of the inventor of the Segway and the founder of the U.S. First Robotics Program, society gets what it celebrates. And the way we celebrate things are through symbols, rhetoric, recognition, and rewards. And they have to align. I'll give you one example of the complete misalignment of symbolism. Secretary of Education Duncan is giving a speech in an auditorium in a high school in Boston, exhorting the kids to study hard because they're going to be competing against students not in Buffalo, but in Beijing and Bangalore. What symbol does he leave behind when he leaves that school? He leaves a signed basketball. That's a misalignment of your rhetoric and your symbols. So I'm hoping that a governor will say, we are going to start recognizing and rewarding the young academic achievers in our school system and in our society and in this state, because those students are going to be the ones that invent the new technologies, that create the new companies, that build the new industries, that employ people in that state. So they're going to change the culture first. The next thing they're going to do is they're going to have the courage to say, if you're going to teach in high school in our state, you have to have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in the subject you're teaching. And they're going to set that as a standard. The next thing that they're going to do is they're going to say, our kids can't possibly be educated to the global standard if our curriculum is not up to the global standard. And so they're going to raise the curriculum up to the global standard. And that's relatively easy to do. I mean, you can look at the Finnish curriculum, which is published in English. The national curriculum in India is published in English. You can get it in great detail. Now in China, it's in Mandarin, but I had it translated. It's not that expensive to have it translated. So they're going to put the curriculum up to the global standard. The next thing they're going to do is they're going to say, in our state colleges, we are not going to have the common application where you write essays about useless things. We're going to let people in based on their academic achievement. And then the last thing is there's going to be choice. Kids learn different ways. American students have less choice than any of the students in the top performing countries. And I can go into a lot of detail on that. But for example, in India, 50% of all the students in school in India, so 100 million students, go to private for-profit schools. They have a lot of choice. Now, it's expensive, absolutely. But you know what? Indian families realize that that's important to their children. So in the Indian household budget, after food, shelter, and clothing, the fourth largest expense is education. In China, you're able to transfer your child to another school in that city, and the money, call these commies crazy, the money travels with the student. In Finland, you can also transfer between schools, and they also have just an outstanding VOTEC program. So you again have a lot of choice. American students have almost no choice. There are only 3,000 charter schools out of the 100,000 schools we have. So I'm hopeful that some governor and the leadership within some state that really cares about their children and really wants their children to be competitive in the 21st century. And we're seeing, a quick sidebar, we're seeing a hollowing out of the middle class right now in America, and the jobs that are moving, that are disappearing during the recession aren't coming back. They're moving overseas, or they're being automated, and we're going to face some very serious financial and economic issues in the years ahead. But some governors are going to say, we are going to make a change for the better. We're not going to try and copy the states around us. We're going to do something different, and we're going to change our culture, our credentials of teachers, our curriculum, our college expectations, and choice. That's what I hope happens.
Bob, is there a state that you think is close to this or getting ready for it?
Yes, the state of Indiana, led by Governor Mitch Daniels, and with the state school superintendent, Tony Bennett. They have made more changes in the last legislative session, moving their educational system toward the global standard than any other state by far.
Okay, so if you've got a question for Bob, you can raise your hand. To raise your hand, that's the third icon over in the participant area. If you hover over it, you'll see a raised hand message come up. If you raise your hand, I'll give you the microphone. Larry, I'm going to give you the mic, but I'm actually going to ask Royce's question first that came in the chat. Bob Royce asked, assume we increase teacher education standards, we change the way we train teachers, and we change the way we teach our students. How long will it take before 80% of students benefit from that type of teacher?
if Finland is the model, it will likely take 15 to 20 years before you see a change. But you know what? America always wants a quick fix. Guess what? We didn't get into this mess quickly, and we're not going to get out of it quickly.
Okay, Larry, I've given you microphone capability. To turn your mic on, you click on the talk button. I think you know what to do. Not hearing anything, Larry. So that's the talk button at the top left of your screen in the audio and video area. You should see your mic come on. If maybe your mic might not be configured. If it's not, you can go up to the audio setup wizard. That's under Tools. Oh yeah, there you are.
Okay, I was just wondering, is there any difference in the technologies that they use in Finland in the classroom or with students? And are the classrooms structured differently, or is it just a different way that teachers are, who's allowed to be teachers, how they're trained, and the curriculum? Thank you.
That's a good question, and the answer is yes. How they teach is quite different. And I'll just give you kind of a couple of examples. There's a lot more project-based learning in Finland, and where they have a project and where teams come together and work on things as a team. They also have, pretty pervasively, certainly in their high schools, they use a system called Moodle, M-O-O-D-L-E, which stands for Modular Object-Oriented Digital Learning Environment. It's a system created by a gentleman in Perth, Australia, who has both a PhD in education and a PhD in computer science. And it allows the students to work on projects collaboratively online. And so they do a lot more project work. And then in the classroom, I mentioned they don't have a lot of homework. I should have mentioned their classes are also 75 minutes long. And the reason is, actually, one of the students states it in my film, because the first 5 to 10 minutes of every class, people are getting settled down, and the last 5 to 10 minutes, people are packing up. And when they had only 50-minute classes, they really didn't get much done. So, the thing said, well, let's make the classes longer. First, they experimented with 90 minutes. That seemed to be too long, cut it to 75 minutes. During that time, when they're doing this knowledge discovery that I mentioned earlier, the master teacher is able to go around and give a lot more individual attention as the students work on problems there in the class. So there's not a lot of lecture. The teacher moves throughout the class. The classes, they configure the class the way that the teacher and the students want. It's not always set up with all desks facing front. So I would say that the key things that I saw were lots of project-oriented, lots of hands-on activities, lots of team efforts, a very sophisticated computer system that allows project work and project sharing, which actually I've seen in a number of charter schools around the country as well. I've not seen it in any government-run schools, but I'm sure it exists. And then the master teacher moving around and able to give much more individualized attention to each student.
Maybe somewhat related, or maybe already answered. There was a question in the chat. What significant technology tipping points have there been in the Finnish education system?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, Steve. They adopt new technologies pretty quickly. And again, in the film, you'll see it. I was amazed to see a class on marketing, which was part of their VOTEC program, which is a very rich, well-funded, and well-taught program. 45% of all Finnish high school students take the vocational tech avenue and get so much training and skill that they're able to get great paying jobs coming right out of high school. But anyway, so this one class was about marketing, and they were on Facebook. And again, it gets to this issue of trust. The teachers trust the students not to be goofing off on Facebook, and so they were doing research on Facebook. And the teacher makes a comment: when a new technology comes out, we need to adopt it quickly because no one knows where it's going to go, and so our children have to embrace it and learn about it. So there was not kind of one moment where they decided they were going to put all kinds of technology in the classroom. It's constantly evolving, and they embrace new technologies with incredible rapidity.
So if you have a question for Bob, we probably have time for one or two more. It looks like Larry's raised his hand again. Larry, I'm giving you the mic. Go ahead.
Was there any, can you hear me?
You can.
In how they treated or incorporated librarians into their system, the school librarian and technology experts?
Yes, I didn't cover it specifically in the film. It's mentioned a couple times, but the schools work very closely. They do have school libraries, but they also work very closely with the public libraries and very closely with museums and art galleries. There's a lot of student trips to museums, but it's not just showing up and walking around the museum. The museum is kept abreast of where they are in the curriculum, what they're trying to learn, and what the specific objective is when the students go to visit a museum or art gallery. So there's this kind of collaborative sense in Finland that everyone is involved in and can make a contribution to the education of their children. And so it's not just something that's done in school. It reaches beyond the school walls.
Bob, are you familiar with Yang Zhao, and have you ever been in a dialogue about his sense that those PISA tests and other tests aren't actually measuring the things of value in American business? It seems like you'd have a unique perspective on that, having been so actively involved as a businessman.
Yes, I know him quite well. We held a head-to-head debate at Indiana University about 2 years ago. He and I view the world very, very differently. I'm not an educator. I don't have a degree in education. I have an MBA from Harvard, and I start and build new companies, and I've been involved in 30 high technology companies around the world in my career. I've had losers and I've had huge winners. So I come at the world and I come at this education more as someone who hires the well-educated. And going back to my original, when I started and talked about my company in Bangalore that had 100 software developers, well, that company now has 1,100 because that's where we can find the talent. The United States only graduates 60,000 engineers per year, and so it's not a matter of, I'm not trying to cut costs. In fact, it tends to be slightly more expensive because of the managers we have to fly back and forth and the infrastructure we have to have there. It's more and more companies than I know are expanding in Asia because that's where the large numbers of highly talented people are. And so Yang and I see the world very differently. He sees it from the perspective of Michigan State University being part of the College of Education, and I see it more from the perspective of an entrepreneur who is hiring people around the world and building companies.
Robin's raised her hand, but there are two questions in the chat. And as a courtesy to our guests, we always end on time. So I apologize that we're not going to get to every question. But Bob, one question that came up was, how does a Finnish school differ from the U.S. in the lower grades?
I didn't. I covered that a little bit in the film, and we did a little bit of research on that. There's a lot more of the arts. There's a lot of music and theater and a lot of hands-on projects. The thing that struck me most interestingly is that a team of 2 teachers will stay with the same students for 3 or 4 years. So when they start the new school year, and they go the same school year length as we do. They have a 3-month summer break, the same as we do. But when they start that new school year, a 2nd or 3rd grade group, it's for the most part the same group of students and the same teachers. So they don't have that kind of startup lag that I see in elementary schools in America, where in Finland, when you show up on the first day of school, it's what did you guys do over the summer, and what did the teachers do, and okay, let's get down to work.
Bob, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm clapping for you. I'm hovering over the smiley face emoticon and going down to the applause button. You can do the same. If you raise your hand, we'll understand. But it's been terrific to talk to you. Thank you so much for this film and the others, and for your taking time tonight to be a part of the show.
Thank you, Steve. I enjoyed it.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. Next week, Richard and Rebecca Dufour on Learning Communities. After that, Howard Gardner, whom we heard about tonight. You can see the schedule up there. Sure appreciate your being a part of this, and the recording will get posted later tonight. Thanks. Take care, everyone.